You know, what if? What if everything we've been told about finding the one is just wrong? Today, we're going to dive into a guide called Virtue and Vision that flips the script on marriage prep. It argues that the whole journey doesn't start with finding the right person, but with becoming the right person.
Right out of the gate, this guide throws down a pretty bold challenge. It asks us to consider, is our endless search for the perfect partner actually setting us up to fail? This one question is designed to make us stop and rethink our entire approach to relationships. And look, it gets real fast. It doesn't dance around the tough stuff. It taps right into those deep, nagging anxieties so many of us feel. You know the ones. That little voice asking, am I actually good enough? Or that fear of, am I going to be waiting for this forever? By hitting on these insecurities right away, it paves the way for a totally different solution.
Okay, so this leads us to the absolute core of this whole thing. A huge philosophical shift it calls heart over hype. It sounds cool, right? But what does it actually mean in the real world?
So here's the fundamental choice it lays out. On one hand, you've got what the world is constantly screaming at us to focus on, the external stuff, the looks, the job, the hype. But this guide says, hold on, let's flip that script entirely. It's about pivoting and looking inward instead, at things like character, maturity, and what's really going on in someone's heart. So where does this idea even come from? It's not just pulled out of thin air. It's anchored in this really foundational concept from the book of 1 Samuel that while we as people get so caught up in what we see on the outside, a divine perspective looks straight to the heart. And that single idea becomes the bedrock for this whole way of thinking.
All right, focusing on the heart. It sounds great, right? But it's also a little fluffy. How do you actually do that? Well, this is where we move from the big idea to the practical, nuts and bolts action plan for how to build up those inner qualities.
And this is where things get really interesting and maybe a little countercultural. The argument is that getting ready for marriage has almost nothing to do with dating apps or clever strategies. It has everything to do with your own personal growth. It breaks it down into 3 stages. First, you got to take a hard, honest look at yourself through self-reflection. Then, you ground that in some spiritual study. And finally, you actively work on building your character. The bottom line here is powerful. The real work starts with you, long before anyone else is ever in the picture. Okay, so let's say you're doing all this internal work. Great, but now what? How does this actually change the way you date in the modern world? This next part connects the dots, showing how all that personal work becomes a sort of practical test. And here's the game plan. The guide is super clear on this. You have to figure out if you share core values before you get swept up in all the emotions. It's about being strategic and proactive, kind of like a health check for the relationship, to make sure it's built on something solid, not just a spark. Now, when it says common values, let's be really clear what that means. We are not talking about liking the same movies or both being into hiking. This is way deeper. We're talking about the core, non-negotiable principles you're going to build your entire future on. They're like the actual pillars that have to hold up the whole structure of your marriage. So what kind of values are we talking about here? Well, we're talking about the heavy hitters. Things like, how do you each approach your faith? Do you share a vision for your family or for serving others? How do you view money and finances? These are the big ones, the crucial conversations you absolutely have to have early on. So after all this hard work, the self-reflection, the values-first dating, where does it all lead? What's the goal? Well, the guide gives it a name, the Proverbs 31 vision. Essentially, it points to this figure from the biblical book of Proverbs, the virtuous woman, as a kind of North Star. Now, the point isn't about being perfect. Nobody is. It's about having a clear, aspirational blueprint of what strength, character, and maturity can look like. That vision becomes the target you're aiming for in your own life. And really, that's the ultimate payoff here. The whole idea is that when you focus on who you are becoming, when you have that clear vision for yourself, you're not just stumbling into a marriage. You are intentionally building the foundation for a partnership that's not just happy, but strong, resilient, and deeply purposeful. So it all boils down to this one really powerful question to leave you with. What would happen if we took all the time and energy we spend searching for the perfect person and invested it in becoming that person instead? How might that fundamentally change, well, everything? Just something to think about. Thanks for tuning in.